creatively. Okay. So yeah, I think that people were really concerned about making sure that people weren't visiting sites on their actual computer, but now you can do everything through your phone. So it's about the time you spend at work and actually focusing. Which ties into some of the things that we're talking about today. Yeah,
and that's I thought it was a great topic, like to take a half a day out of the office, not so easy, but as soon as I saw that, it's like, I'm all over that.
Yeah.
Just brilliant.
There's so many different facets, right? As we were putting it all together, we were thinking like, and what about this, and what about this, and think about that, you know?
Yeah, it goes across so many streams of the kinds of issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, and just as context, for when I was in law school, I never thought that most of my day would be spent just on the phone problem solving. It's probably the same things we do with you guys, but it's not as much drafting and sitting and doing that kind of stuff as we thought, but it's just trying to figure out, how do we get at this problem? And yes, there's a legal standard we should look at, but here's like 4 kind of options with different risks and just problem solving. So so we are recording, but people don't quite have access to it yet. So as soon as they have access, then we'll start and go ahead. So So I am acting like a millennial, keeping my phone on the table, but one of the reasons for that is that they're going to forward the questions to us here so that we can do it. So
that's why I got mine. I don't usually.
I
was made fun of actually the other day for my Costanza phone.
Oh my gosh,
I was like, well, I need this credit card and that credit card, and I need my Presto, and like, where am I supposed to fit it all? So it kind of sits rockily on the table.
As long as you've seen the new ones, there's a couple of girls in my office now, and literally it's like over the shoulder, it's the big leather strap, like thin, and it hangs, and it's got the case for the phone, like one of the larger, smartphones. And it does have so I don't think you could squeeze this many, Patricia. But it definitely could hold, like you could put in a few business cards, you could put in a credit card.
It's like the modernized fanny pack, but not fanny.
Exactly. So it's substantial. But they just think that, well, we're always running around. Like when we do our big trade show, and I said, well, like pockets, like they're too big now for pockets. Right. So what do you do? And it's like, well, why don't you just carry a little?
I can't fit it.
Actually, have waterproof ones now. You can go into the pool with your phone.
Wow!
Oh my God! We were at the pool, right? So when we were
So
vacationing in Bahamas, I actually had that with me the whole time. I put cards in that and
Yeah.
everything.
When you're at the what do you do?
We're good to go. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so it sounds like it's time to move away from the shutter. Although this has been very helpful, I'm going to look for the waterproof phone case. So thank you to everyone for tuning in, and thank you for your patience while we got the live stream up and going. Today is Piccolo Heath LLP's first roundtable discussion. And as you know, we're going to be talking about the multi-generational workplace. A few housekeeping items, mostly for the people who are watching, which is that there are some materials that are linked below in the YouTube screen that Courtney also sent out before. If you have any questions, you can send them through the live chat, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, or what we'll call the old-fashioned way, which is probably the way that I would use, which is writing to info@piccoloheath.com, and those questions will be forwarded to us. That's the reason for the phone on the table. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can email that website email that account, or you can call 416-306-3828 extension 24, and Courtney would be happy to help you. We will be recording our discussion, so we can also email you a link to this after the fact. So we have some in-person participants who are here today, who we have tasked with providing lots of important questions and lots of animated responses to things to keep you guys interested. So thank you to everyone for coming, and whenever you're asking a question or anything like that, if you want to identify yourself, you can too. And so just as a little bit of an intro before I turn it over to Patricia. So of course, we're talking today about the impacts of age and life stage in the workplace. Patricia and I were talking about this topic and just thinking about why we wanted to talk about it. We were just talking about this with the crew here before. The reason being that it touches and impacts so many of the decisions that are made in the workplace. And I think it's really important for managers and people in HR and ER functions to probe a little bit more when there's problems or issues in the workplace, whether those have to do with gaps or barriers because of the mix of generations in the workplace, or something that is a disability related to age, or something that is a lack of understanding because of somebody who is younger and who hasn't worked in the workplace before. Because as Patricia will tell us, we're dealing with more generations than we ever have in the workplace before. There are communication issues that arise from that, and we want to make sure that that the issues that we're dealing with when we're advising you about problems, that it's not something that's going to touch on age discrimination, which is not just discrimination against older employees, it can be discrimination against younger, and those interconnected overlapping issues of disability and race and gender, and just a lack of understanding around that. So we want to talk about some of those issues.
Cool. All right. So I'm getting us started, I guess. And so I have to say, as I was, we're all pretty aware of the fact that there are multiple generations in the workplace. But for me, what was really interesting is I had no idea, like, where does one start and the other end, and how many are we talking about? And then what are the traits going along with it? So I did some research. And I found, people have done studies on this stuff. And so I thought I would share that, because we're really talking about, although it's 5 different generations as opposed to, like, I normally think of 4, right? But it's 5, and there's very, very few of the first one, which is called the traditionalists. And so these are people that are born before 1946. 4% of traditionalists are still in the labor force. World War II was the seminal event in their childhoods, and they view work as a privilege. And I thought, like, that's very interesting, right? I mean, I'm thinking back, like, my grandparents sort of being in that generation. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time so much on them, because I think it's such a small group in the workforce. But the next one, of course, is baby boomers. So they were born between 1946 and 1964. I did not know when that ended. I was like, sometime in the 60s. I know it was kind of before me, but not quite, right? So, 1964. And so the oldest baby boomers turned 65 in 2011. It's projected that 10,000 baby boomers will reach retirement age each day through 2020. Right, so 10,000 each day. I was like, oh my gosh. By 2030, all baby boomers will be more than 65, and nearly 70 million baby boomers will retire over the next decade. So huge when you think of the impact on the workforce. And for us, constantly, that's there, and for businesses generally, it's about, there's a wealth of information and knowledge that these people hold, and, working to transition that knowledge. And this concept of them letting go, because we've faced that as well, a little bit of, like, we need these people to retire. We can't force them to retire, but we also need them to transition their knowledge and succession plan, right? So one of the comments in this article that I'm reading from, which was UNC, so the Keenan Flagler Business School, they commented that to help HR, they said, to recruit and retain this generation, HR should offer flexible working arrangements and phased retirement programs that will encourage baby boomers to stay in the workforce a little longer, right? So that concept to me was very interesting, because oftentimes when lawyers are reached out to, we're being asked, how do we exit them, as opposed to that retention strategy. So thinking of it, from that other side of the fence. And they went on to say, with a large number of baby boomers poised to exit the workforce, taking valuable knowledge and experience with them as they go, companies should explore effective retention strategies. And they should also develop knowledge transfer efforts to help boomers share their knowledge and expertise with the next generation of leaders, and avoiding the impending brain drain.
And so, sorry, just to interrupt you first, because this touches on some of the topics that we'll be talking about later, but I think there is a recognition, as opposed to years ago when we were dealing with more issues, as Patricia said, trying to exit people. In Canada especially, this is a UNC study, but in Canada especially, there is a labor shortage, and I'm sure some of you have found that people who are here dealing with skilled or entry-level jobs, there's a labor shortage, there's a lot more transients, And when you need people at the other end of the spectrum to fill in some of those gaps that younger employees will not do. So you need to be able to find a way to incentivize them. And we'll be talking about some ways to do that and some ways to think a little bit out of the box and do it legally.
Yeah. So it ties in very nicely, to what they're saying. So of course, then in this study, in this article, they also have this big blurb about, well, why baby boomers aren't retiring. And so they're saying the anticipated mass exodus of baby boomers from the marketplace has not actually happened yet in the expected numbers that they had anticipated. And so the commentary is that for some baby boomers, retirement isn't an option. They want to keep working, and just given sort of the nature of that generation, they tend to be sort of labeled as the spenders. And so they can't afford to retire because they've been living, a certain lifestyle. So I found that really interesting, and the way they intend to retire, of course, but not at age 65. And so we're looking at a much longer period of time, which is good, I think, but as long as those knowledge transfer initiatives are in place. So we move from baby boomers to the next generation, which is Generation X. And this generation was born between 1965 and 1979. It was very near and dear to my heart as I was reading it. I was like, oh, this is very interesting. This is the generation that apparently has been ignored in many of the studies, because there's been this huge focus on boomers and millennials, and so there's the Generation X that's kind of sandwiched in between. Their formative years were marked by revelations by government corruption. So in the U.S., Watergate, environmental disasters, the 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and we became, I include myself in this group, the first latchkey generation. So the first ones whose mothers were working outside of the home on a regular and sort of routine basis. So the comment in this article is that to recruit and retain Generation X, HR and talent management professionals have to allow for autonomous work, offer flexibility, provide clear and measurable goals, because this generation is extremely driven to achieve. It's not about, that work-life balance so much as it is about, getting ahead and doing really well. And so they go on to say, if you want to recruit and retain the generation, you need to appeal to the desire for flexibility in how and where work gets done. And Generation X apparently also values learning and creates new skills and experience. So they can satisfy this desire with opportunities and challenges through the organization, both vertically and horizontally. And this generation is typically very independent and entrepreneurial by nature. So really wanting to develop new businesses and all that. So I found that super interesting. Then we move on to the millennials, who were born between 1980 and 1995, and by 2020 they'll represent 46% of the U.S. population. I don't have the numbers for Canada, but and we've heard so much about millennials. But what I found particularly interesting was obviously there's a technological fluency with this generation that certainly didn't exist in prior generation, and it has an effect on their interaction with others and their expectation on the flow of information. So previous generations, and especially the traditionalists, as I was reading this, didn't expect to have corporate information. They saw information sharing as like there's a hierarchy. Information is sort of kept up here and held tight, and only what was needed, on a need-to-know basis was dribbled down.
Like a division of authority.
Absolutely,
okay. Yeah.
Right? And not sharing that information. Whereas millennials expect that everything be open and shared and thrive in those types of environments where there's open information sharing and so on, and are not hierarchical that way, right? So that need for the flow of information, they're saying could be at the root of some of the workplace conflict between millennials and baby boomers. Because baby boomers were raised in that hierarchical environment, and traditionalists as well, and the flow of information was constrained. So I thought that was interesting. I also thought that in this article they commented, and as I reflect on this personally, I feel it to be true, is millennials are the most educated generation. right, have had the most opportunity to receive education, whether men or women, right? In certain societies, they're speaking from a U.S. standpoint.
I think in the workforce, right, it's almost automatic that people are getting a university degree and in fact might be overeducated, right? Which may also cause some of the conflict, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when they were talking about tip retention and recruiting tips for millennials, they were talking about keeping millennials engaged, and employers have to offer this generation meaningful work. Not that you wouldn't offer meaningful work to other generations, but even more so. And millennials want to know how their work contributes to the larger mission, as opposed to working in silos or just being content to sort of do what they need to know. They need to know what the broader community, how they're going to benefit from that. And they also seek opportunities to give back through volunteerism and philanthropic activities. So very interesting. And then the baby generation, the Generation Z. And I found this fascinating because this is the generation that's just beginning to enter the workforce. It's the generation I'm raising kids in Generation Z. And so I found it very interesting that what is projected to be sort of the attributes of this particular generation. So they're born starting in 1996. The oldest of this generation is just entering the workforce, and having an impact on the world may be important, maybe more important to these folks than their actual jobs. And they're even more technologically plugged in than millennials, because I was reflecting on this. I thought my kids don't know what it's like not to have the internet, right? And by comparison, I was like, I grew up not knowing what it was like to not have TV. As my grandparents, there was no TV, right? Like it just didn't exist. So it's similar, but so much more, connected. So they will place. It's anticipated they will place more value in the work experience over actual education. They are going to have the highest level of technological connectivity. Many of them will spend virtually all of their waking hours connected to a computer, a tablet, a smartphone, or other electronics. And like the millennials before them, this is going to affect their preferences and work styles, including how they communicate, how they gather information and learn, and how they work with others. And I found another article that did just a quick comparison between the millennials and Generation Z. And I found that the most interesting thing for me was, when they were looking just at their personalities. So millennials grew up during an economic boom versus Generation Z grew up during a recession, again, from a US standpoint. Millennials tend to be idealistic. Generation Z tends to be pragmatic. So I started to sort of notice a little bit of a trend in looking back to who the generation was raised by, right? So millennials raised by boomers, Generation Z raised by X. And so you see some of those similar traits sort of flowing through, which I found really interesting. The big one, of course, because I was looking for my kids, I'm like, what are they going to be like with money? So millennials are focused on experiences. Generation Z focused on saving money, right? And I found that really interesting as well. And I think that's going to be very interesting as it flows into the workforce. They may actually be more cognizant and more attuned to earning and compensation and all of that because they're savers, as opposed to millennials who are looking more for that experience and that work-life balance. That money is not necessarily as important. And then their social media is millennials prefer Facebook and Instagram versus Generation Z that prefer Snapchat and Instagram. So that's the different generations that we're dealing with. One of the things I just really briefly wanted to talk about it and open up, I think, a little bit to the floor was, the generational workplace trends and how they're impacting different industries and different sectors. Again, I found an article on how it impacts sort of the office sector. And from my own experience, I see it as like, I very much, and it may also be because I'm a lawyer, but, sit in an office, sit at a desk, for me, it's got to be ergonomically, correct, all of that, versus sit on the floor with my laptop or work from anywhere, a cafe or like I can't do that. I need my quiet, reserved space. So seeing those differences in the generations, I think that's a huge impact on where workplaces are located, where the offices are, people working remotely more so, and all of that. So I was wondering if each of you in your industries have seen that interplay and how it's affecting the way that your industry is actually, running, like taking into account the differences. Like that's an office environment, but what's happening on the golf course, right? Like,
well, we have a unique situation. I mean, there are a lot of the studies that exist out there spoken of there being 4 generations in the workplace. But we
Right.
actually have 5.
Right.
One of our oldest employees is 84 years old. He turned
No
85
way.
this year.
Wow.
Discussions of him retiring have not been had yet, and I don't believe that we'll be entering them anytime soon because he's still a productive member of our team and so on. But as far as just going back to your question, we don't necessarily have much of a challenge in terms of where our employees are placed because we're central. We have to be where we are. We're a golf and country club.
Right.
We've got a small segment of our staff that works in the office. We do offer flexibility, the ability for people to work from home as needed, but everyone has to be in-house for us to be able to service our members. Right? So the option for them to work out of a laptop at a coffee shop and what have you is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Rather, it's quite small because it really only speaks to those who are in the office and
Right,
those who partner with it and what have you.
right, yeah. Anyone else thoughts on, like, have you seen and how the different generations are sort of changing?
So at that elevator, so we have the office and we have the manufacturing. So what we notice is, so my problem is majority of our workforce are millennials. So I would almost say 45%. Yeah. So a lot of our management, senior managers, they're in the Generation X. And one baby boomer. But you'll see that with us, flexibility of hours and ability to work from home is always been something we communicated. But the millennials, they are using that opportunity to do that. So they may not come in some days. They may come in at 11 p.m., but they leave late as well. And everyone's different. But when you see managers who are baby boomers and they manage those millennials, they don't feel it's the right thing to do. So it almost kind of shames them and they don't really feel comfortable doing that. But with the Generation X managers, they're very comfortable doing that because they know at the end of the day, work gets done and people do that. Now, you wonder, in the office, probably easy. What about manufacturing? Our hours are directly impacting labor, right? With the output and production. We actually practice flexible hours as well. You'll be interested to know. We found that a lot of the baby boomers, ready to retire, have not had those conversations. They tell us, maybe next year, maybe next year. But what they do is they keep asking year over year, am I getting a bigger increase this year? Why are you still asking for an increase if you plan to retire soon? So what we found worked was we actually gave them flexible hours. If you could do less hours or you come in late, as long as you get your work done, you want to spend your morning with your wife, go ahead and do that. And they're perfectly happy.
It's interesting that you say that because there have been some studies recently, mostly focusing on millennials and Gen Z, talking about how they would actually take a lower paying job if it meant they had more flexibility in their hours, which is in some ways crazy to me because you're usually looking at the bottom dollar, but it makes sense. But it's interesting that you're saying the baby boomers are looking for that too. And so that I think speaks to a couple of things. One, baby boomers who are thinking about retirement but don't want to do the hard stop, right? And so offering those options allows them to sort of trail off in a way, or at least sort of dip their toes into it. And I think when you're talking about just offering that option, it just gives people a different way to have benefits that don't mean bottom dollars out of your pocket. So I really think that it's important to explore that. And I would say, I mean, some of the articles and the research that we're talking about today, there's a reporter who works for CBC called Brandy Michael, and she's done a great series on work and the impact of work in Canada. And I think that that's, there's a ton of articles that speak to these. I think the more flexible you can be and not assume that it's just millennials who want to work flexibly, work remotely, and think about how that option could help everyone and keep some of those baby boomer or employees thinking about retirement, keep them in the workplace for longer, keep that skill set and keep that variation, right? Because you need to have that training, that mentorship. I think that's really important. So that's great, and it's great that it's working effectively for them.
Yeah, especially in a warehouse environment where you think of, well, no, there's production that needs to happen. And so how do you, I guess my question to you is, how do you manage the product that needs to go out the door, but yet having people working sort of flexible times?
So we've come to the realization, the workforce knows that at the end of the day, if my work gets done, it doesn't matter how many hours I put in, although they are paid hourly, but I find in the new generation, in the multi-generation actually workforce, a lot of them these days don't care for the money or the bottom dollar when they take home. If they want to work more, they'll just do more overtime that week. If they don't want to work more, they actually go off, leave absence to go home to some country and visit for 4 weeks, and they're perfectly okay getting no pay, no EI, nothing. And it's become almost a retention tool perhaps, where we're beginning to notice that trend. Of course, we were a little concerned because people were going on leave absence, but if they started to plan, or if I know more of what person was going on leave absence at the same team at the same time. So it almost has this, they have this understanding that, yeah, the business still has to sustain. We're going to do what we need. I'm going to be here for a long time, and the company is willing to allow me that time off.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why we changed the salary employees to start with 3 weeks, and after 3 years, they go straight to 4 weeks of vacation. It's what they value more than what they take home.
So time away from the office, that matters.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I think
Well,
go ahead.
and for baby boomers who are increasingly challenged for having flexibility and time out of the office, because more often than not, we're caring for parents as well as for children. And you cannot manage your life on a rigid 9-to-5 schedule. And with the advent of technology and all those options for being able to work remotely, you go to any baby boomer and they can absolutely rhyme off the number of times they've had to work from a doctor's office, a hospital bed, a school, something to that effect. So I think it's just a reality, but you're right, it was a hard thing to get your head around initially, because then you're also thinking about all of the younger generations who, we have all generations in our office. We're a trade association and we're across Canada. So we have people working in different time zones as well. But we have people in home offices and people who still want an office to work in. They don't like the cubicle setting, but they'll come in at any time. They work till any time. They work from home anytime. And they often work from their phones. And they only come, you can only retain them if they like what they're doing. If they're not passionate about what they're doing, then it doesn't matter about flexibility, and you're right, it doesn't matter about money. They have to actually care about what they're doing.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting when, we're talking about trends and things like that. Not every millennial is the same and wants the same thing, not every baby boomer, but it is interesting to think of this age and stage of life impact of people who are in their childbearing years and they've got kids and they've got to flex to things. And then you've got those people who are baby boomers and trying to do that parental care and thinking about how allowing that flexibility and finding ways to permit them to take that time off. They're facing the same situation, right? It's just a different stage of life. And so looking at that and trying to keep employees is a really important balance, because there's sort of two things that came out of my research, which was there was a study just came out yesterday talking about 10% of employees with kids under 6 have had to actually change their hours, not just miss a day or come in late, have actually had to change their work schedule because of a lack of childcare.
Mhm.
No, and that's talking about a delay and because they can't get a childcare spot until their kids reach a certain age, with which that extended parental leave now helps a bit with. But people who actually said, I can't do this. 10%, that's really important. Again, when you're thinking about a labor shortage, it's an employee's market. And then on the other end of things, you know, we hear a lot of stories of employees who have to either retire early or who are using their personal sick days, that kind of thing, to care for a parent. And you're losing people because you don't have that open discussion about these things. Of course, the other side of the coin is when people are taking advantage of these things. So I think for employers, it's important to assess the situation and say, okay, is this someone taking advantage of a situation because they don't want to work and they just want to take their sick days and have their kid need it too? Or is this somebody who has a code-related need? And so there's a person who either is in a parent-child relationship, so whether that's a downward, right? They have a young child at home or a child with an illness, or if it's an employee with a parent and that parent is dependent on them, that's something that comes under the Human Rights Code or the Human Rights Act if you're a federally regulated employer. So it's really important to be able to assess and not have that knee-jerk reaction when people make those requests, but also to make sure that your managers don't have that knee-jerk reaction, because that discriminatory attitude can lead to liability for the organization. Yeah.
So while we're on the subject, something comes to mind. How do we go about making sure that we are accommodating those with children, those needing flexible hours and so on, parents, and the millennials who are sometimes having to work evenings and weekends and shifts that one who is a parent will typically not get. I always wonder if we're stepping into discriminatory grounds when we do offer flexibility to those who have children because they have other obligations outside of work, and then we have the millennials who have all the time in the world and can be scheduled all over the place and have scattered schedules and not a fixed Monday to Friday or 9 to 5 type of schedule. I don't know if I'm stepping ahead, but
no, it's really the burden of the childless employee or the parentless or careless employee. Not to say they're careless, they don't have care obligations.
Right.
And you're right, because there is a corresponding tension that happens when you're accommodating these people with family status needs, as opposed to people who might have preferences, or if you're impacting those people who have to take on the burden of, you know, shifts they don't want to take. So that's something that comes up for us all.
I actually had done some research on it because it was embedded and it's appropriate that we're talking about it now. So York University did a study and they found that professionals without children often feel that they're less entitled to ask for the time off and feel more obliged to sort of step in. And of course, the study didn't have any resolution in terms of how you actually deal with that. But as I was thinking about it, it really is about being attuned and your leave policies being equal, for people, acknowledging that just because someone doesn't have a child or doesn't have parent caring responsibilities doesn't mean that they're not entitled to a work-life balance and those types of leaves. And making sure, to your point, I think, Nelsa, that when you're asking people to work these different shifts or different hours to sort of fill in, that it's truly a voluntary situation. And they're not being quote unquote voluntold you're working it, or just told like this is what you're doing because this is what the business needs, right? It's having that, I think, that conversation to avoid that, what we would consider sometimes that reverse claim of discrimination, but it's the same thing, right? It's I'm being discriminated because I don't have child care responsibility or parental care responsibility.
I think you have to make sure that people understand what the policy is there for. It's there to help people who have a need based on a disability, based on a family status need, based on a religious accommodation. So making sure your policies build that in, but then taking a step back and saying, okay, does this mean that the 22-year-old without kids who lives around the corner is working every early morning weekend shift? And thinking about, okay, if that's happening, how do I schedule work? So this is working with your schedulers to say, okay, does that mean that we go to that person and say, look, we're not going to ask you to work more than 2 weekends in a row with this, and we'll accommodate you, small A accommodation, because they don't have a human rights need, to say, you get first pick of vacation, or you get this weekend off, and we won't do this to you more than 2 times in a row. So I think it's about putting the needs first, but then looking and making sure that you're not punishing somebody who's on the other end.
Right.
So yeah, and I think that's the way to do it, so that there's a perceived fairness,
Right.
and that there's not angst between people who don't have, the excuse of, I have a kid at home, I have a parent at home.
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
yeah.
So I guess we're moving on to, covered some of the legal issues affecting all employees, right? Jen, did you
Yeah,
want to say on that?
I think maybe just a few points, and this is the 4th slide that's for everyone at home, but just quickly to run through them, the bullet points. So we recognizing that there's different work styles and expectations and needs of the generation. So we've talked through some of that, but I think what we often hear from our employer clients is that there are frustrations, there's a decision to terminate someone, a decision to discipline, or a problem that we're talking about, and diving through and figuring out whether there's an age-related or a generational related issue that's happening. And sometimes if we're in HR and ER roles or performing those managerial functions, we have to act as a bit of an ambassador between those generations. There's a legal impact to avoid the discrimination claim, but there's also a practical impact of having a healthy workplace. Rethinking training. Patricia had mentioned, how well-versed a Gen Z employee would be in certain kinds of technology, but somebody who's a baby boomer, or not to pick on necessarily Nelson, the 85-year-old employee, but they haven't grown up with the iPad. So when you're thinking about how training is being rolled out and how convenient it is for everyone to do an online module, not everyone can learn that way. That might be an age thing. That might be a comfort with tech, because not every millennial is the same. And it might be a learning disability issue. So again, being attuned to that and making sure that if someone isn't well-versed in the new rollout of whatever tech you're using, it's not something that can be a flow through to age discrimination.
Touching on that point about that's actually something really interesting happened. So with the baby boomers, we know they talked about possibly retiring. There's a lot of knowledge, we call it tribal knowledge, where we're at. We try to have newcomers who are once millennials, and maybe possibly even Gen Zs. They come in and they're rather impatient because they're so technically well-versed, that when they listen to a baby boomer trying to train them on the job, they have no patience. And in fact, instead of listening, they try to teach the baby boomer. And what happens as a result is the baby boomer then goes, I'm not teaching anymore. And that becomes a problem because we can't now bridge that transition. And because a very new problem for supervisors right now, and where they have to adopt new techniques to try to get them to work together. To try to get that knowledge that we're not able to get out of the baby boomer, we're shy, and they try, and now they're completely just
So you have to think about that cross mentorship. And maybe pairing up people. And again, this is as much a legal encouragement, but also a practical encouragement. You can't put 2 people together that aren't going to get along. But thinking about how a younger person can be a resource for the older person, just like how I would be for my grandparents for helping them with using a computer program. But then also how the knowledge transfer of, a module or a training manual isn't going to teach you what Joe, the 65-year-old who's been here for 30 years, can teach you about problem solving and about how to deal with that manager who's going to come after you. There's people skills, and there's just experience that you can't get from a book. So trying to instill that in people off the bat, and also trying to make that part of the performance review. How well do you work with others in this cross-mentorship kind of way? Because I think stereotypically, of course, millennials may miss that, or Gen Z may miss that the people skills are as important as what the output is at the end of the day. But yeah, that's a problem that will continue to happen, but people have to see value in that and have to encourage that. Talking about updated policies, we talked about, flexible work arrangements. I know of a couple of organizations, and this may be something that tweaks a memory for you guys, but some organizations have beefed up their EAP programs because they were noticing that there were a lot of employees who were missing work because of emergency childcare or parent care obligations. They've brought on organizations like Nurses Next Door, things like that can do emergency assistance, babysitting, daycare, parent care. And it's a great way to minimize absences and a way to make employees feel supported. That's not a bonus or some kind of increase. And I think that's really important where you have somebody who might be in a manufacturing situation where if they're not there that day, you can't fill in, and it means you don't make your orders, things like that. But I think it can also help for office situations too, just that somebody has that opportunity to say, okay, I can go to work and then I can provide a little bit of care at night. And it acts as that bridge towards them getting in-home care if that's something that's needed. And then a couple of other things, we talked about this a little bit before, encouraging managers to change their definition of success. So making sure that they understand face time is not the most important thing, and getting them to accept that. And then again, on the flip side, using the stereotype of the millennials and Gen Z is saying, part of your performance indicator is how well you perform in meetings. We said at the beginning why we have our phones on here. We have our phones on here because we want to be able to ask questions from our viewers. But for a millennial or somebody that thinks it's okay to continue talking or typing on their phone, they have to understand that will negatively affect their performance review. And so being really clear about expectations, because the things that we may think as it's a default, you have to engage with the person in a meeting, you have to do this, and they may not understand that is part of the overall reflection. So be really clear about expectations. Say it out loud to them, because what you may assume as a 50-year-old manager is not necessarily what a 25-year-old salesperson will understand about what the expectations are and what will lead to success.
On that point, I think it's also about adaptability of both of the parties, right? As opposed to assuming, well, the millennials needs to become comfortable in this face-to-face meeting. Is recognizing, well, if I'm leading a group that all of them are not comfortable in this face-to-face, because really they talk through this, right, is perhaps reflecting, as a manager myself and saying, well, but how can I adapt to their needs and their communication style so that I can change? And maybe it's not having that, I'm very comfortable in a face-to-face, but perhaps stretching myself a little bit as that older generation or manager and communicating in a way that makes sense for them, as opposed to making them communicate in a way that makes sense for me.
And to build on that, I know a lot of our clients our offices are so close together, so we just yell at each other, but there are people who use Slack or GChat or other things to communicate with one another, and there's people who are not comfortable with that. Yeah. So maybe saying, okay, while you take time, 50-year-old manager, to get comfortable with this technology, the young people are going to use it. And then at the end of the day, or when there's an issue, this person is tasked with going to your door and bringing that up and just finding a way that it works for everyone. Not everyone is going to be trainable, but they have to adapt and learn and check in once in a while. So just finding ways to sort of bridge that gap. Some really technical legal things that have come up in my work and Patricia's work is recognizing that there is a more transient workforce and less perceived loyalty with the younger generations than there once was. We certainly see employees who've got 30, 40 years of service once in a while, but they're like unicorns, right? And so you cannot expect that that's going to be the way with people in their first few years of work. So looking at your employment contracts and thinking, okay, if I don't want that information, that data to walk out the door, how do I protect myself as an employer when dealing with that? And then also thinking about if I want to keep someone, if I want to attract them, maybe I offer them training opportunities or that flexible work or that paid mat leave or pat leave. And then think about how do I do a clawback so it incentivizes them to stay and disincentivizes them to leave. It works both ways, but building that kind of concept and making sure that your employment agreements reflect what the workplace is. And every workplace is different. How do you have the carrot and stick in there, I think is really important. And there's all kinds of comp consultants will talk to you about long-term incentives and how that's important too. But I think you need to look at, if I'm trying to build a relationship with a young person in a sales role, maybe they need to see a more immediate, tangible benefit. Maybe that needs to be a quarterly commission. Maybe they need a performance review every 6 months and have that direct feedback. But again, don't rely on your assumptions. I mean, what we've talked about here are trends in each of these groups, but there's diversity within each of these groups.
Employee agreements. So what we've noticed with our organization is a lot of the Generation X or even millennials, they started to ask for things like, can I have it in my employment letter where you say I'm going to get a review of my salary and my performance in the next 3 months? They're a lot more impatient. But even then, so they've even asked, like, what does it look like for me in terms of succession? I know I'm going to join now today as a project coordinator. But how long is it going to take before I'm a project manager? Is it going to be 3 months, 6 months, 1 year? However long it takes, I'm hoping it's fast, of course. I want to see that.
Right.
So one of my HR coordinators actually had a great idea, which is in our job postings, we wanted to start posting what your path may look like if you join us in this position. What will be the next path?
Fabulous.
It attracts them.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
funny that
Interesting.
It's that transparency,
Yeah.
right, that
Yeah.
they're looking for, that Tricia was
Yeah.
mentioning as part of what they're doing.
It's very interesting. And Jen and I actually had this conversation because of course we employ a millennial. And so very different, right? We were doing sort of a touch base sort of meeting on, projects that we've been working on and so on. And I commented, and I remember the look of shock on both your face and Chapin's face, where I said, like, I worked at a firm for 16 years and never had a performance review. It was just like, there was nothing formal, there was nothing, sort of set in stone. There was no, path to partnership sort of set out. It was just your day-to-day interactions. You knew if you got the sideways look, you didn't do a good job. If you got the, oh, this was good, you did a good job. And that's the way it just flowed. And so for me, it's very different, to sort of be trained to, that people are not like they want those touch points and more sort of formalized criticism, constructive criticism and feedback, right? So huge, like I lived through it, and so it's interesting to me to sort of see that that change and that shift and be living through it.
Yeah, and I think we probably just internalized it, and especially in a law firm environment, it's almost implicit that you just won't get feedback. You have to just sit at your desk, for 12 hours a day, and then spend the rest of your time worrying about what your status is. Law is super fun, guys. But I think now it's more important for us to reflect what's going on generally, which is, more consistent feedback, more openness, more transparency. And for us to adapt to what people need. And I think, ultimately, taking the time to do that means that you've got more engagement from the people that you're working with.
Yeah, so, and it's hard, like speaking from experience, it's hard to retrain your brain when that's not the way that you're used to. And conversely, it would be hard for someone who wants that to think, well, that's, to think a different way, right?
Yeah.
So it's just turning your minds to all that.
Yeah. And to add to that, and on the flip side, of course, it is demoralizing for them not to have that feedback.
Right.
And they want it, they crave it, and they feel that it's part of their, they each know the why. Yeah. And it's important for them to know that when I come to work, I do a good job, I'm told that I'm doing a good job, and feedback, of course, I should say is important. But it's so demoralizing, and they speak openly about it.
Yes. I was having a discussion with some former law school classmates the other day, and they were explaining to me that people who are coming up in the workforce are more comfortable with the language of mental illness and anxiety, using those terms, which is great. And that's really important that we have that awareness. The sort of downside to that is that they're more likely to use the words of mental illness related symptoms as something that constitutes mental. So, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious. Well, we've all felt that. And it's not to say that everyone needs to go through the hazing process that some of us went going through. But when they use those words, it tweaks other things. And so we have to say, okay, you are feeling anxiety because you haven't had your review yet, or you're concerned about the sideways glance that you got. But that's important not to blend that with, I have an anxiety disorder and I need to be accommodated. And so, while there might be more recognition of those words, just trying to translate that for other people and calm some people. Yeah, exactly.
Right, and also dealing with the attitudes sometimes that come along with that, right? Like, and stereotypically, of course, older generation may be just like, suck it up, right? Yeah. As opposed to recognizing that, no, there may actually be a medical issue that we need to deal with, and you can't just tell someone to suck it up, or even think, just suck it up, right? It's like that rolling of the eyes has to, even if it's internal, has to stop, right? And be attuned and aware to all of the issues that come along in the different language that's used and how forthright people can or can't be, right?
So I think we can move on to talking about some of the family responsibility obligations, and I'll keep an eye out for any questions that anyone who's here might have, or any comments too. Yes.
So as we think about the different generations, and in fact, even just the different stages in one employee's life, because we move through all of these, there's the things in sort of early life of earlier in life, either the childless employee, and we were talking about those challenges and them being a little bit more, reluctant to ask for leave time because they perceive that they may not be as entitled to it, to employees who may be experiencing fertility issues and the need to take leaves or time off or have flex time associated with the multiple medical appointments that go along with that, for female employees, the hormonal stuff that happens along, with all of that, and being attuned to that request and that need. Whereas you may have had an employee who was punctually in the office at, 8 a.m. every morning. Well, if they're going to the fertility specialist, like that's when they've got to go. So they're going to have to, start a little bit earlier. And there's also, of course, the privacy issues that go along with that they don't want everybody in the world to necessarily know they're going through this particular stage or thing or item in their life. And so sort of turning your mind to that flexibility and being careful about how open the organization is to not to giving the flexibility, of course, that would be needed, but to talking about it and talking about why, Mary Smith may now be on flex hours. Well, Mary Smith may not want you talking about why she's on flex hours, right? And sort of dealing with those challenges. So if you think of your younger employees dealing with that, and then there's that sandwich generation that Cheryl was referring to earlier, where there may be people who have childcare obligations, but also parental care obligations, and it's a double whammy, right? And dealing with that and dealing with the time off that may be necessary to deal with those issues and handle it and be flexible. And when I think of these, I think of there's a case that sort of sticks in my mind. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about because of course I never remember the name of the case, but I remember the facts, because the facts are the juicy part. The name is like but it was a case about an architect who was working in a firm, and he was a partner in the firm, or senior employee in the firm, and he had an elderly mother that he needed to take care of, and the mother worked with him, and the office was adamant that he needed to work. Sorry, the mother lived with him. Did I say work? Lived with him. And the office was adamant that he needed to perform his work in the office. And he was like, I don't understand that, but I could work remotely, be just as effective, and so on. And there was like this doubt from his office mates of, is this really a preference or a need, right? And it's the case that sort of started to teach employers, because the outcome of it was you need to have that conversation. Yeah. And to understand whether you're perceiving that the person is playing around or not, doesn't really need this, and that it's a preference, versus it actually being a need, and the opportunity being able to then demonstrate that no, this was a need. He was the sole caregiver for his mother, and the judge going so far as to say, like, you can't force an elderly person to move into a home, right? Like, because the employer was sort of looking at it saying, like, but why does she have to live with you? Well, because that's her choice, right? And I need to be there. I can't leave her home alone, and I can have people coming in and taking care of her every so often, but I can do my work, from home. So needless to say, that employer got nailed with a whole bunch of damages because of the failure to accommodate this person's need as opposed to the preference. And there's so many cases where we talk about taking care of children and the focus on taking care of children, and this one sticks out in my mind because it was this man taking care of his mother and making the very I think important argument and point that, like, I can't force her to go into a home, and I'm the only child, and so she lives with me. I'm going to take care of her. If she had chosen to go into a home, then my life would be different. Right. But I can't force her, to choose. And so I've got to deal with what I've got to deal with. And here it is. Like, get a plan, there's all flexible arrangements, and sort of reinforce the need to have that open conversation with people to really understand where their requests are coming from, and is it really a preference or is it a true need, and again, protected by provisions of the Human Rights Code, right?
I think the main mistake that employers make is that they have that knee-jerk reaction and assume. I think the most important thing, accept all of these requests in good faith, and then do the math. Say, give me all the information. Here's what I need as the employer. I need to hear from your mother's doctor. Tell me a little bit about the day-to-day. We're going to take that, and then we're going to assess your job and see. But if you just say you have to work in the office, well, if you can't show, even if you're correct, even if you are correct, as an employer, if you don't show that you've considered it properly, write it down, put together a plan, then you're still going to get dinged, even if you were right.
Because the attempt has to be there.
Exactly. That's the procedural element of the duty.
Yeah, because there's two parts to it, right? You have the actual duty to accommodate, but you have the procedure that you need to engage in, and if you fall either one of those, there's damages that follows through, right? And then we're also seeing legislation sort of catching up with the reality of some needs, like the extension to parental leave time and 18 months. I do remember a time, as I'm sure many of you in the room remember, when the institution of a 12-month maternity/parental leave was a big thing, because it was 3 months before, and then moving, and employers just having this knee-jerk negative reaction to how are we going to deal with someone being out of the workforce for 12 months? And now it's commonplace, and like, lo and behold, look at us, we've made do, right? We've figured it out. And so this 18-month hasn't seemed to me, at least, to be as much of a shocker, but more reflective of the reality that, we were dealing with a gap for many, many years where employees just couldn't find childcare because the daycares won't take children that are younger than 18 months old. And so what do you do in the interim? And you're relying on family, you're relying on friends, you're paying privately for a nanny to come into the house, like all of that, right? So giving that flexibility.
That sorry to interrupt you, Patricia, but that ties into one of the issues that we wanted to talk about too, which is a cross-border issue. So for those of you who have operations or deal with US counterparts, I mean, they're aghast at many of the laws that we have to deal with in Canada, but particularly that leave. I think New York and some other states have just extended their leaves, but often they're 3 months. I mean, I'm not a mother, but for those of you who have kids in the room, I can imagine you think, oh my gosh, how could I do that? Or at least have that expectation that you would come back to work. So if you're dealing with employees or managers that are in the US, trying to bridge that gap and say, no, this is an entitlement and we can make do. So have any of you had someone take the extended up to 18-month leave in your
announce their
workplaces?
intention to do that yet?
We have someone on that leave right now, and we didn't make the assumption it was gonna be a 12-month, because she can let us know at the 12-month mark. So we brought on someone for the full 18 months, and if there's overlap, that's fine. At least it's a good transition.
That's right. Yeah, and building that flexibility into the contract with the person that you hire is important in case the person comes back earlier. But then also looking at what are the check-in points with the person who's taking the parental leave, and what are the expectations? Because I've had some employers say, this person just won't respond to our emails when we're up on leave, which, they're busy, I get it, but keeping that connection with that person so that you can plan for your business is important.
And always what comes to front of mind, and Jen, you touched upon it, is really look carefully at that contract of the person that you have hired on, because oftentimes when you're hiring on a fixed term, it's a guaranteed, fixed term. And so turning your mind to having that proper language in there that says, if we need to let you go, here's what we will pay, or the notice that we will give you in the event, and it provides you that flexibility, right? So those were sort of the main, the family responsibility. If you think of it, the different, it's almost not really generational per se, but it is stages in someone's, life and those leaves. And we've seen under the Ontario Employment Standards Act, a whole bunch of new leaves coming forth, sort of like sexual violence leave, domestic violence leaves, bad things happening to your child leave, illness leaves that have all been extended, and taking into account the realities of life, regardless of what generation you may be in, right? So slowly, the law is catching up to the reality that I think a lot of us face. So.
All right, so just a little over 10 minutes left. We want to talk about some issues that are specific to older employees, some of which we've touched on already, but I think there's really important legal implications, so we'll throw in some free legal advice for you in this. So just speaking broadly about retirement options, I still have to have this conversation with some employers that there is no longer mandatory retirement in Ontario, so you can't assume that somebody's gone at 65. You can't plan your business that way. Talking about some different retirement options that are not the hard stop, because we're seeing more and more studies that talk about, particularly baby boomers who are currently in that stage of life, that they don't want a hard stop, or they can't contemplate the hard stop, or they just haven't contemplated retirement because they can't see themselves not working. So there's a couple of options, and Patricia and I have dealt with the very delicate issue of how do you deal with voluntary retirement. So if you're doing a bigger change in your organization and you want to give an option of voluntary retirement, how do you roll that out in a way that doesn't itself lead to age discrimination, or doesn't in effect lead to age discrimination, because you have managers who are saying, oh, thank God, I've got to get Bob out of here. I'm going to really push this mandatory or this voluntary retirement on him, which there are cases about that where somebody keeps like flipping to the person like, hey, have you thought about this? It's not truly voluntary if you're getting pressured. So what voluntary retirement is an offer that goes to all or a specifically defined subset of employees, and it can't be tied just to age, because that is in itself discriminatory. Talking about an opportunity saying, if you wish to retire, here's what the formula would be for calculating, or if you wish to retire, you can, in this anonymous way, flag it. It will go to this one person and they will respond to you and say, here's what your package would look like. And if you accept, then the plan for retirement, the agreement is signed. There has to be a formulaic approach of how you deal. Usually what you would say is, if you're in this set, you get credit, 2.75 weeks per year of service. It's paid in this lump sum way, something like that. So you use a way that, again, has an element of fairness to it. Again, making sure that there's a central point of contact for information and that the managers understand it is not their place to pinpoint, target, or encourage people to avoid that. So there are ways to do it in a way that cuts your workforce and that indirectly may help you to get, I was going to say get rid of, that's not the right term.
I don't have my lawyer hat on right now.
To deal with some employees that are sort of on the fringe that probably are ready for retirement but just haven't done it and personally accepted. So there's a lot of things that tie into that. It can be a very effective way with dealing with a big workforce change, and also where you're doing it to cut costs, but not do it in a way that makes people frantic. It was interesting early last year that Shaw did something similar. Shaw gave such generous packages, shockingly so generous if they're trying to, save money, that a significant number, I think it was like 30% of their workforce accepted it. And that was way more than they had bargained for. Shaw said, no, we're prepared for it, we're okay with it. But I'm sure there are a few people scrambling going, holy crap, we have to pay all of these out. But you can also build in options where you can say, we can pick what your retirement date is so you have that continuity. So you don't have everyone leaving on one day and no knowledge transfer.
Yeah.
Okay, so voluntary retirement is an option, but I will put this asterisk beside it. Patricia and I say this all the time, but this is a really important one. Do this with legal advice and oversight.
Yeah.
This is not something be like, oh, I've got my formula and let's go ahead. Be very careful.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the other options, and again, this ties into the Brandy Weichel series that I'm going to keep pumping because I think she's great, talking about semi-retirement. So I think this is what you had talked about implicitly in those flexible arrangements, which is, not going to people and again, targeting them to say it, but when somebody starts to make those comments about like, I'm getting to 65 and like thinking about retirement and I just want more time with my kids, having a conversation, again, scripted in a careful way and with somebody who's an HR or ER as opposed to a manager who might have their own agenda, and talking to them and saying, look, we are open to some other options and to think about it. And we want to plan. We have some projects over the next little while that we really want you to be a part of. But if you're thinking about it, we can offer some flexible options. Come back and talk to us. And again, document that properly so that they don't hear or construe things as they're pushing me out.
Yeah.
because that's a problem, a constructive dismissal or discrimination, but talking about those phased out, which means, shorter hours, less days, more vacation time off in the summer, things like that. And then, and this ties into the studies that talk about how the vast majority of boomers are interested in some kind of phased out retirement option, but there's a disconnect between how many want it and how many employers have it, or at least how many employers promote it to them. There's a disconnect. There's more people who want it. And the boomers are also interested in mentorship relationships.
Right.
Not every old timer, if I can say that, is going to be a proper mentor. And it's interesting that, boomers really want it and employers aren't offering it. Maybe they're not offering it because there's not, a good cross-reference or cross-training opportunity. But I think figuring out a way to explore that may be another way to help do some sustainability and some continuity planning for you. Just to jump ahead, because I know we only have a few minutes left, there's two recent decisions that I want to highlight about talking about longer term and older employees that will have an effect and should be known by people who are doing the HR function in your business. So one is with respect to a long-term employee who was working at Equitable Life. His name was Dawes, so that's the case name, only because I read it this morning. Patricia, I never remember. So in this Dawes case, it's actually a really shocking decision that just came out a little bit earlier this year. It was an employee who was 62 with 37 years of service, so pretty long term, but not the oldest and not the longest term that we've seen. We've certainly seen more even in the case law. And he was a senior VP and he was let go. And he asked for 30 months of notice. So there's generally this soft cap of the oldest and longest serving employee will generally only get up to 24 months, although in the last few years, we've seen 26 to 28 months, okay? So it's a soft cap. He asked for 30, the employer disagreed, and the judge in that case actually went beyond and said, you know what? He assessed the evidence and said, this gentleman was 62, he didn't have any set plan of retiring. He said, I would have worked till at least 65, but I didn't know beyond that. Interesting that he was 62 and hadn't made that plan, but everyone's different. The judge said, had you asked for it, I would have given him at least 36 months. At least 36 months. That goes way beyond any of the caps that we've contemplated. So he looked at the evidence of this man had no plan to retire and was going to work for at least 3 years. And he looked at the evidence of, well, if this person did try to look for other employment, comparable employment, and couldn't find it. I think just for context, this was a senior VP at an insurance company, so his base was 250 and his last bonus was 350. Very difficult at that. I know. How do we sign up? So this, the employer and the employee did a good job of showing his mitigation efforts and saying, if I was going to look for other employment, sure, there's other jobs, but comparable employment, who's going to want somebody at that age? Right. So the judge had made a statement. They only awarded 30 months, luckily for Equitable, but that statement of I would have gone up represents perhaps a new trend where judges are recognizing if this person can't get employment, maybe we have to go above that soft cap and well above. That there is a recognition that there are older employees who are just not going to be able to find comparable work. So a really important lesson for employers that when dealing with employees at that age and stage of life and with that length of service, that they really have to recognize that the damage awards could be a lot more, but also then maybe an important aspect of thinking about those retirement discussions. I'm sure that company didn't think, on that day, we're just going to terminate him today. That was probably part of a plan that had been coming for months. Why not have that open discussion with the employee and say, look, we're looking to make some changes. What about talking about a 6-month period? Then we talk about, your departure, or you move on to special projects. And that might have tweaked something in this gentleman's mind and had the discussion. And think about the money that they would have saved. 36 months or 30 months was the award at that level of compensation at, 600. Ooh. Okay, so good lesson. You guys won't be in that situation because you'll think about it properly and you've done the seminar. The other decision was one that came out last year and a lot of hubbub was made of it, and we don't know if there's going to be any fallout because we don't know if there's been any consideration or whether the parties settled. It was a decision from the Human Rights Tribunal that talked about an employee who was 65 and his benefits, his health, dental, and life were ending at age 65 through the school board's health plan. So he challenged it. And under the Human Rights Code and under the ESA, there's permissible discrimination with respect to benefits ending at 65. Insurance companies will not insure beyond 65 for certain kinds of disability. They will insure beyond that for health and dental and sometimes for life, although it might change the levels. And what this Human Rights Tribunal decision said was, no, that's improper and that provision should be struck down. It's discriminatory on the basis of age. And what it really was, it's technically discriminatory because it says over 65 you can't get this benefit, but it was something that was allowed by the legislation. We don't know whether that will have a ripple effect to the legislators making changes, although the Ford government seems to be intent on making some changes unrelated to that. So this is low on the priority list right now. But it is something to think about and make sure that that you're preparing your employees for changes in benefits that could happen and alerting them to that, making sure that they know, because in this situation, and I think the facts are important, the employee had a spouse who was part of the spousal benefit plan who was suffering from ovarian cancer, and both he and her needed to make sure they had those benefits. So if employees aren't aware of the changes in benefits that are coming, there could just be bad facts that could ding you, but I think employers should be prepared that there could be some changes, but really those changes are mostly going to affect the insurers who have not contemplated in their assessments how to insure these people who arguably have a greater need for those benefits and a likelihood of passing away where those payouts will
Yeah, I've actually had some pretty in-depth conversations with some of our clients about this very fact and them trying to be proactive as opposed to sort of just lying down and accepting that at age 65 their benefits are going to cut off and they've got to prime these employees for that, is proactively having the conversations with the insurer to say, help me out here. I want to make sure that my employees who are over age 65 are whole and that they're taken care of and not relying on, you know, certain plans that will have retiree benefits because they have to retire to get the retiree benefits, right? And sort of having those conversations as well, and also looking separate from health and dental benefits, but also the pension plans that stop participation in the plan at age 65, and seeing, you know, how if you're continuing to work, you know, can you continue on in those pension plans? So very interesting, and some of the feedback that I've heard from those insurers is they're actually more than willing to open it up, provided that the money is being paid.
Oh, I was
So
gonna
the
say,
premiums go
they'll
up.
do anything.
The premiums go like this, right? They're like, yeah, you want this? Sure. Come on down, you can have it.
Yeah.
Pay up, right? Because they do the annuity and the, you know, the whole analysis of how expensive it's going to be for those individuals. And they're like, sure, employer, happy to accommodate, but here's what it's gonna cost, right? And so it's also thinking as an employer and building that into your financials and thinking like, how are we gonna deal with that added cost? And not thinking we're gonna pass it down to the employee, right?
Well, but then on the other side, maybe you can, because maybe what you say to the employee, you give them notice, right? Depending on how much the employer is paying of the premiums, to say, look, I mean, putting aside the discrimination decision, what might change, saying to the employee, in 6 months, here's how your benefits will change. You can take these steps in the interim to increase things. Here's how we could work out the premiums. We'll still pay the same proportion that we were before, but the extra will come off of your pay. So I think that's, I think it's just, again, thinking about flexibility. The side benefit of that is if it's an employee that you're ready to start having that exit discussion with, telling them your benefits might change. And by the way, you're not getting any pensionable service after this. You're not getting, any benefit to your pension. Then maybe that tweaks the discussion.
One of those interesting ideas just for employers that are actually thinking about it was, and I heard this through a discussion that was talking about, well, as employers, like how do we tackle this and the increased costs and so on, is moving to plans, if you don't have one already, where they're flex plans and there's a pool of money, if you will. And so getting away from the discriminatory aspect of, well, at age 65, this cuts off. No, if you have a pooled plan that's available, it's, yeah, you can have this benefit for as long as you need it with a lifetime cap of whatever, X, right?
It's almost
So
like
you
a
could be
healthcare spending.
Right, exactly. So you could be 70 and you could be utilizing this benefit plan, but over the span of your lifetime, this is the maximum
Right.
amount. And then negotiating those maximums with the insurer as opposed to set insurance and the premiums hiking up, right?
Yeah.
So just interesting ideas.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this sort of ties into, benefits that you can provide to employees that don't even need, they don't even know that they need.
Right.
Is having a financial planner come in to talk
Right.
to employees, both young and older, right? So maybe, people who are younger don't understand the benefit of getting disability and having that early on.
Right.
And there are similarly some more senior employees who may not understand the changes that are coming for their benefits. So providing those kind of services is a really important new sort of perk that a lot of employers are providing.
Yeah.
And it's something that might spark some conversation and some good morale from your employees. So,
Cool.
All right, it's 11 o'clock. It's time for everyone to
Thanks,
get back to their real work.
everyone.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and of course to all of our attendees for contributing and
you for
making it a
having
lively
us.
conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Great.